chilling tales for dark nights.
I often like to view creepy things on the internet. I don't totally know why. I've just always been intrigued by things that are just off. Any media is fine to take in the content. Stories, movies, videos, audio clips, video games, whatever. I just want to be unnerved. I work third shift, so my sleep schedule is all messed up. I sleep during the day and work at night. I get 2 days off a week, though, and always in a row. I could use this time to have some semblance of a normal life, but I'd rather not have to readjust my sleep schedule once work starts again, so I just stay up all night and sleep during the day. So, browsing the internet on one of those days off, I came to a thread which had a bunch of links on it. Each comment was just a link. Some of them led to websites about unexplained mysteries, some were streams of horror movies, and others were accounts of paranormal events, which were supposedly true. Then I saw one that was none of the above. I don't remember what the link was. It was just random letters and numbers. It was nonsense. I clicked on it, and it took me to a single page with a single picture and nothing to click on. It auto full-screened and refreshed at random intervals anywhere between roughly 2 and 10 seconds. There was text at the top of the picture which read, "Zan you wait, X to die." X. Creepy. I like this site already. The picture showed a painting on the wall of a nondescript forest scene. There was a small TV screen centered at the bottom of the picture, an old CRT. On top of the TV was an older-looking analog clock with a wood frame and fancy hands. The site continued to refresh, but the picture never changed. Out of sheer curiosity, I didn't leave the page. I kept the tab open and checked back every minute or two. Still no change. After about 10 minutes, I got tired of missing the refreshes. Maybe it was changing drastically, but only once every minute or something, and I was completely missing it. So I closed all the other tabs to make sure I wouldn't be tempted to leave. I was staring at that picture for what seemed to be an hour. I checked my phone. It had been 26 minutes. I guess time goes slowly when you're just staring at a still image online. I can't say what it was or when it was, but at some point I noticed that it wasn't just a still image. Well, it was, but the image was changing. The clock, when I first pulled up the page, read something close to 4:15. Now it was showing 4:56. The clock had been changing the entire time. I watched it for a full minute, and somewhere along the refreshes, I saw the minute hand change to 57. The time on the clock didn't reflect the real time. Still, though, this was dedication. Someone had to take a picture once per minute for an hour, or at least 45 minutes, and then have it change every minute. I kept watching it until it showed 5 o'clock. I expected it to shift back to 4, but it just went to 5:01. That's even more impressive. Maybe it went a full 12 hours. Someone needs a job. Anyway, now I was hooked. I had to see if it had the full range of times. Now that I knew I didn't have to intently stare at the picture anymore, I was able to shift my focus to the text. It definitely seemed strange. I realized quickly that it was a code of sorts, and it said XIIXIX. I thought about it for a while, but then realized the colon in the phrase XII:XIX. 1219. I guess I had to wait till 1219 to see what was going to happen. What was so worth all this work? The next few hours were boring. I'd check it every so often and see no change. Once I thought I saw something in the painting, but I'm pretty sure that was just my imagination, and my mind wanting to see something. I set all my clocks in my house to the time on this site, so I'd know where it was even when I wasn't at the computer. 12 o'clock came and I was glued to my computer. No getting up, no other tabs. I was just staring intently, watching the clock's hands refresh minute after minute. 12:18. Refresh, refresh, refresh. I was certain that this minute had actually taken 4 or 5 minutes to transpire. Finally, 12:19. Nothing. No change in the image. No change to the site. That was disappointing. I figured I'd at least get a message on the site, or a different picture, or something. Maybe that was the prank. Nothing. The guy who made this would lure people in, give them a simple puzzle to solve, just to pique their intrigue, and then disappoint them greatly. Bravo, I thought to myself. Or brava, I quickly corrected. I left the website and went back to my day. I couldn't get the site out of my head, though. Not even an hour after I left, I had convinced myself that I should go back to the site. Control plus Shift plus T. After all, there were 2 12:19s in a day, aren't there? The clock now said 12:48. I looked over at the clock on my desk, and it also said 12:48. The creator must have kept it synced up with their local time or something. I had nearly 12 hours wait ahead of me now. I could have stayed up all night. Night for me, day for most normal people. But I didn't want to drive myself crazy, so I went to sleep. I didn't sleep well, or for very long, but then again I rarely do. I checked the clock on the desk, which was still set to the website time, and it said 8:52. Only a little over 3 hours of a wait from here. I checked the site and still no change in the image. I did things around the house and online to kill the next few hours. As soon as the clock was near 12, though, I was once again seated firmly in front of my computer screen. The next 18 minutes were agonizing. The last minute was even worse. The hands of the clock once again struck 12:19, and once again, nothing happened. I was distraught. I had invested a lot of time into this. The minute wasn't over, though, so I continued to watch. Then I heard a click. Quiet, but still audible. After that, I noticed that the web page wasn't constantly refreshing anymore. The screen on the TV began to brighten. Finally! What I had waited for was happening. As the screen on the TV brightened, I began to be able to make out an image. It was small because the TV screen on my monitor was only about 2 inches wide, but I could still clearly see that they were showing woods. Maybe it was the forest in the picture. The camera was bobbing up and down as grass and leaves passed by. It must have been someone filming themselves walking. The camera was kept pointed at the ground for the first minute or so, but then slowly started to point more horizontally. I could see that they were coming up on a yard. Some houses flashed quickly on the edges of the screen. There was some talking in another language, but I couldn't say what the language was, and then clicks and clunks like they were dealing with equipment. The camera made larger movements than before. I realized as the sounds went away and the image stabilized dramatically that they were setting it up on a tripod. Once they got it set up, I heard a little more talking. Then the camera made one final turn. During the turn, I could see that it was set up just along the woods. The camera had finally stopped shaking, and there was a house centered within the frame. As small as it was, I could tell it was my house. I jumped up from my desk chair, but kept my eyes fixed on the screen. The men abandoned their camera and walked up to the house. Walked up to my house. They stood at the door for what was probably 20 seconds, but it seemed like 5 minutes. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if there was anything to do. They knocked on the door. I heard it faintly through my speakers, but it wasn't at the door. Not hearing it within my house calmed me down enough to check the door. Nobody was there. Nobody was in the yard, but I couldn't make anything out past a couple 100 feet. It was dark out, and the moon wasn't very bright. I closed and locked the door and ran back up to the computer. The screen was still displaying these two men standing at the door. They knocked again, but this time harder. I watched as the door opened. A man answered it. I couldn't make him out. I was half expecting it to be me. I was relieved, though, to see that it wasn't. I have brown hair. The man on the screen had red hair. One of the men gestured something to him, and the red-haired man begins to close the door. At this point, the other man shoves the door open again, pulls a gun from his belt, and shoots the man in the head. I felt my face go pale and my jaw fall open. My vision started to go black, but I forced myself to keep my composure. The two men ran from the door and toward the camera. In the small TV screen in my monitor, and in the blur of motion, I could still see that both men were smiling wildly. They grabbed the camera, not bothering to take it off the tripod, and ran into the woods again. The camera swiveled on the tripod and showed one of the men's faces, but quite blurrily. He looked at the camera, reached over toward it with his other hand, and the screen of the TV went blank. The page refreshed again, but only once, and the clock still read 12:19. I exited out of my browser and even shut down my computer. I ran to the door one last time to see if I could see anything. Once again, there was nobody there. To this day, I have no clue what actually took place. I haven't had the nerve to revisit that website or ask anybody what happened to the people who lived here before I did. And I'm not sure I ever will. Bateman hated to be late. He was irritated, after wasting half the morning trying to convince his wife to come to Oscar's funeral. Now, ascending to the entrance of the Père Lachaise crematorium, he was further annoyed at having to weave his way among a group of large cats sunning themselves on the broad steps. Near the top, tired of watching his feet, he carelessly trod on a tail. The yowl was quite loud enough, he thought with amusement, to wake the dead. But the cats did not scatter with alarm. Instead, they arched their backs and glared at him with malevolence. With a nervous backward glance at the cats, Bateman passed into the cool gloom of the crematorium. He delayed a moment in the doorway of the crematorium chamber. Pierre was seated among the small clot of mourners who faced the door of the funerary oven. It reminded Bateman of the time he peered into the courtroom during Pierre and Alicia's divorce 12 years before. Now he hesitated, preparing an explanation for Alicia's absence. Damn her stubbornness. The children, they were a good excuse, of course, or perhaps she could have a cold. Yeah, a cold, he decided. Let him mention the children first. Perhaps he could avoid Pierre's reproachful glances, which always made him feel so guilty. The furnace door was rising to reveal the red glow within. With a whine of automatic machinery, the plain pine coffin slid inwards. Bateman seated himself behind Pierre and his sister. The door descended. That was it. As the group rose with a collective sigh, Pierre turned and saw Bateman. He noticed Pierre's disappointment in not seeing Alicia by his side. Bateman said, "We're really very sorry, Pierre." Pierre answered almost rudely with a perfunctory nod and told his sister to go along home, that he would wait to receive the ashes alone. The group left, and the two men stepped out of the crematorium and strolled across the broad paved plaza. Oscar, the deceased, had been Pierre's brother-in-law. He had died of drink, one might say, but in a most macabre way. Oscar drowned after passing out cold under the Pont Neuf during a rainstorm. The river simply rose around him. The police found him there with no carte d'identité. They took the fingerprints, but Oscar was born in Toulouse, and before they reached the family, the body had bound over to the public crematorium at Père Lachaise, the famous cemetery in the 20th arrondissement. It was simpler to go ahead with the pauper's funeral. "We were lucky they did him alone," Pierre said to Bateman. "They usually cremate indigents 4 at a time." Bateman looked up in surprise, but said nothing. They scuffed along one of the gravel paths of the cemetery, blinking at puddles of light stippled on the ground. It was a lovely late afternoon, and the leaves of the ancient trees rustled above their heads. "How is she feeling?" asked Pierre, meaning Alicia. "She's fine," said Bateman, reflecting that he was no more certain of her feelings than Alan Kardix, the long-dead spirit medium whose granite tomb they were passing. "And Janine?" asked Pierre. "She's fine, too," said Bateman. Janine was Pierre's daughter. She had just been a baby when Alicia divorced him. Pierre was a morose, silent man by nature, but today he seemed to be groping for a way to prolong the conversation. Bateman felt sorry for him, knowing Pierre found it difficult to overcome his shyness and self-restriction. But Bateman wasn't feeling his usual voluble self either. Their path was crossed then by one of the enormous cats which resided in the cemetery. They seemed to be everywhere, peeking at one from behind tombstones, skulking in the musty vaults. They were huge, and Bateman supposed they made their diet on field mice and other rodents. Pierre said, "Look at the cats, they're so large." Bateman smiled. He felt he could predict each thing Pierre said. The man's mind was that of an engineer, he thought, strictly oriented to the concrete and the real. Bateman could look ahead and pick the most remarkable features of the cemetery's paths. As they passed, Pierre was sure to remark on each. Bateman was amused at this confirmation, not for the first time, of the difference in their characters. Bateman had always been able to ignore the obvious, to act as though the real conditions of life and requirements of propriety simply did not exist. Alicia was like that, too. When their affair had begun in a small gallery on the Rue du Bac, the rest of the world had seemed to fade into the background. Her marriage to Pierre, their child, and Pierre's position in her father's brick and tile factory were all secondary to the paramount fact in their lives, their love for one another. Bateman had been on a buying trip, adding to the art collection of a man who owned several department stores in New York City. For many months, he and Alicia burned up the telephone lines between Paris and New York. He used up his savings on airfares. Finally, Bateman convinced the wealthy New Yorker to station him permanently in Paris. A few years later, Bateman opened his own gallery. But the period before the divorce was painful for all of them. Pierre stayed with Alicia all that time for Janine's sake, preparing baby bottles and coping with early morning colic. Alicia pursued her blossoming career as an artist and her American lover, and somehow between the two found time for her baby. Bateman imagined that Pierre had preferred to have them near him, even without Alicia's love, than to have neither. Afterwards, Pierre never found another woman who suited him. It was an act of sacrifice of which Bateman would not have been capable. Because of it, Janine grew up a happy child. During that year, Bateman and Alicia shocked their friends and family by carrying on an open affair. She often brought Janine around to his apartment or the galleries, but often as not would leave the infant with their father. When Bateman would call her from New York, it was inevitable that Pierre would sometimes answer. Bateman hung up the first few times that happened, but as they became somewhat inured to the situation, he began asking for and leaving messages. Pierre bore it all with not a single word of protest to Bateman. Bateman looked at Pierre, reflecting that it was probably that same repressed, unimaginative quality which had allowed him to survive that trying period, to say nothing of the last 12 lonely years. He saw the tail of a cat disappear behind a tree. "I wonder what the cats eat," he asked. "You suppose someone feeds them?" Pierre laughed in that muffled way of his, a kind of tight-lipped, bobbing of the head from which no sound of mirth came out. His eyes kept their eternal sad expression, but there was, for once, a twinkle of animation. He said, "I was talking to one of the men who work in the crematorium before you came. I asked how things were with the ovens and so on." "What do you mean?" Bateman asked. "Delay did an overhaul on the brick linings," said Pierre. Delay was Alicia's maiden name and the name of her father's company, which Pierre still worked. "Oh, I see. The bricks must be replaced every 4 years or so. It wasn't a very big job." "My God, look at the size of that cat," Bateman said. "He must weigh a good 10 kilos. Pierre looked at the tabby cat. "He's a big one, all right," he said. "The fellow told me a funny story about the cats. I don't know whether or not to believe it." "What was that?" The tabby cat was gazing at Bateman with that manic expression they acquire when they're hungry. "The ovens have gas burners," said Pierre. "They reach 1200 degrees, but gas is so expensive these days that they try to economize by reducing the time between cremations so the ovens don't have a chance to cool down." "Well, that makes sense." "Yes, except it means that they must remove the previous corpse sooner. Often, with a large body, especially one that has been frozen, the bones aren't completely reduced to ashes." "You're joking," Bateman said. "What do they do then?" "Well, generally they break the bones with a raclette." "A raclette? Like the bakers use?" "More or less, but that's not the worst of it. The skull and brain are a bigger problem." "The brain?" "Oh, yes. You can imagine. It's enclosed and surrounded by fluid. It's very difficult to burn, and in summer the bodies must be kept frozen. It takes much longer to burn a frozen corpse." "I do see what you mean," said Bateman, a vague nausea beginning in his chest. "At any rate, the fellow was saying—" Pierre fell silent as they rounded the corner. They had come to a section of the graves covered by graffiti, much of it obscene. "I want to fuck you, Jim. The Snake. Patrick, Harley-Davidson, 1984. And finally, sprayed in Dayglow colors across an unmarked granite slab, the explanation. Jim Morrison. The Doors." They stood staring at the hundreds of chalked, painted, and scratched inscriptions. Some had been there for years, but others seemed quite fresh. It was appalling to Bateman. They seemed mindless. He was ashamed of his own country, even after all that time away. There was a small group of bicyclists relaxing at this curve in the path. The bicycle was a nice way to see the cemetery. The paths were smooth and free of traffic, but no one could wander among the stones. They had left their bikes locked together and gone off a little way among the weed-strewn graves. Bateman and Pierre could hear their laughter as they examined the old-fashioned inscriptions. The bicyclists came forward toward them, speaking English, 2 boys and 2 girls walking straight across the graves, without regard for the path between. Bateman looked away. The sun went behind a cloud, and he thought to look at his watch. 5:30 already? It was getting late. He walked a little way down the path, not wanting to see the desecrations performed here to commemorate an American rock star. Pierre remained at the spot, reading the names and comments. A few minutes later, Bateman looked back to see Pierre kneeling by the bicycles, talking to one of the boys, no doubt about the machines. Bateman could see the plaza of the crematorium, and across from it the columbarium, where the urns of ashes were installed. His eyes were caught by a strange scene. In the middle of the plaza, a large German shepherd dog stood motionless. Even at a distance, he could see the bared fangs and the tail lowered between the dog's legs. Surrounding the dog were about a dozen large cats. One of them advanced on the dog, and the ring of cats contracted toward him. The closest cats swatted at the dog, and it appeared they were on the point of attacking him en masse when a man came out of the crematorium and brandished a long stick at the crouching cats. They backed off and watched the man pull the dog away. There were sounds of laughter and some sort of a tussle among the boys and girls at the bend in the path. He wasn't paying much attention. Pierre was still back there. Bateman knew that the sepulchre, which held the ashes of Victor Hugo, was somewhere in this area. A little further down, he could find Rothschild and Gertrude Stein. The sepulchres were quaint. Some were furnished with a sort of low chair with a padded backrest, designed for kneeling in prayer, called a prie-dieu. A few had hooks on the walls for hanging wreaths. Though most of the vaults were securely locked, many were open, and he peered into the shadows of one which had been used as a shelter by generations of winos, to judge from the amount of green bottle glass on the floor. Curled on the faded seat of the ancient prie-dieu was a large gray cat with yellow eyes. Was it his imagination, or was that cat staring at him with a particularly feral look? He had never been fond of cats. When they opened their mouths, showing the tips of their tongues, their eyes glazed over in some humanly unimaginable feline ecstasy, he found them positively loathsome. He wanted to be out of that place. He looked at his watch again. Nearly 6. He really had to be going. He turned around to call to Pierre and found himself staring into his face. He covered his shock with a nervous laugh. "Oh, so there you are," Bateman said. "I thought you had bicycled off with them." "No," said Pierre, frowning. "I really must be getting along," Bateman said. "I told my wife we'd go out to dinner tonight." For the moment he had forgotten to whom he was speaking, but it was too late to recover gracefully. "Of course, I mean Alicia," he said. "Of course," said Pierre. "Myself as well. I've some work to do." "Look, Pierre," said Bateman, "I'm sorry." "For what?" asked Pierre, his eyes flaring suddenly. He was angry, Bateman realized. Bateman was quite taken aback. It was the first time he had seen Pierre show his temper. Pierre had something, a bit of metal in his hand, and he was worrying at it with his fingers. In tense silence, they walked a shortcut between the rows of decrepit graves and thick foliage. The shadows were lengthening, and Bateman felt uncomfortable walking ahead of Pierre. There was a tingling in his scalp. Was he afraid that Pierre might, after all these years, take some sort of physical revenge? He had never uttered a word against Bateman, never hung up a telephone, never left a message go untransmitted. As cuckolds went, Bateman thought he had been as cooperative as could be imagined. Bateman regretted his thought immediately. Pierre was 10 times more generous than he was. He deserved his sympathy, his help, not derision. "You were telling me something before," said Bateman, turning around. Pierre was walking, his eyes downcast, his hands clasped behind, and Bateman was even more regretful of his unspoken mockery. Pierre looked up slowly. It seemed Bateman had disturbed an interior monologue. "Yes," he said, "but I don't believe it myself. Still, I suppose it would be interesting to know the truth." "I'm not following you," said Bateman. "The cats," he said. "You asked how they'd gotten so fat. You would expect them to be starving, and there are so many." "Yes." "Still, I expect you're right," he said. "Someone else probably feeds them, though the man in the crematorium seemed serious." "Pierre," he said, "you're talking in circles. I wish you'd come out and say what you mean." "The way that you do?" asked Pierre. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "Never mind. Come on. Maybe I can show you where the cats eat." They had come via the back way to the columbarium. It was nothing more than a wall of niches in which the urns were placed. A plaque engraved with the name and dates was fixed in each place. Some were empty and were marked reserve. They strode across the broad courtyard fronting the crematorium, the massive building now backlit by the reddening sunlight. They left the plaza and continued toward the exit through an older section of graves, terraced to several levels. This was now a low-rent district, with many more abandoned graves and fewer splendid, well-kept ones. "He said he put it somewhere around here," said Pierre, scaling an incline to reach a higher level. They were among the large trees which blocked the sun. Twice, Bateman stumbled on creepers as he tried to trace Pierre's footsteps. "Incredible," he heard Pierre say. "The guy was telling the truth."
Bateman emerged into an overgrown area nearly hidden from the main grounds. There was a small cluster of ancient family sepulchres with doors of rusty iron grillwork. Pierre was kneeling on the worn cushion of the prayer stool in one of the vaults, examining the contents of a small dish. He gingerly backed out of the small stone structure. "Take a look," he said. "Watch out, there's cat shit all over it." "I don't wonder," said Bateman. "Look over there." There were no fewer than 25 large cats congregated around the doorway of another sepulchre. He shuddered and peered into the gloom of the vault, trying to make out what was in the small ceramic dish. He had no desire to dirty his hands on that floor. "You won't be able to see it from here," said Pierre. "It's too dark in there." Bateman stooped into the confined darkness. There was a withered wreath and plastic cross suspended from hooks on his right. He had to kneel on the prie-dieu to get a good look at what was in the dish. He recognized it immediately. Nothing looks quite like brain tissue with its twisting convolutions, but he had never seen a brain this large before, and it had already been partially consumed by the cats, he assumed. He was violently startled by a spider crawling across his hand. He crushed it against the stone wall with the back of his hand. There was a gentle thump and the rustling of leaves above him as something landed on the roof. A large cat, no doubt. Someone blew a whistle. It was closing time. He started to rise from the prie-dieu and heard a loud creak. He felt the tomb door close against his shoe soles. That was no accident. There was a loud metallic click. He turned around, difficult in the confined space. He looked down at the door latch and saw the glint of a sturdy combination lock, the kind used with bicycle chains. It had to be Pierre, but he could see no one. He shouted, "Open it up, Pierre!" There was no reply. He was sure Pierre was still nearby. He remembered him kneeling with the boys at Jim Morrison's grave. After they had gone, he had a bit of shiny metal in his hand. "Mercandagno," he heard, along with the muted thuds of several pairs of padded paws. The huge face of a cat appeared in the window grating opposite the locked door, its insane eyes glowing gold in the dying light. He threw all of his 200 pounds against the iron grating. It looked as though it would shatter with one lunge, but did not. Again, he heaved into it with his shoulder. It was no use. He couldn't back up enough to get momentum. The cat in the window jumped down beside him. The faces of two others appeared in its place. The huge cat on the floor took a swat at his ankle, cocking his head as though curious to see his reaction. He felt a sharp pain and kicked out at the cat. It arched its back and hissed, sounding very loud in the tiny space. If they all attacked him at once, as they had been about to do in the plaza, he wouldn't be able to hold them off in the claustrophobic space. He could barely move his arms and legs. "Pierre!" he screamed. "For God's sakes!" There were several loud thuds. 3 cats were suddenly on the floor with him. Another, a huge black one, was in the window. It leapt at him. He felt the stab of claws in the back of his neck, and a forepaw raked his right eye. With all his strength, ignoring the claws, sharp as needles, he wrenched the animal off and hurled it against the wall while kicking out at the others, which had begun to attack his legs. "Help, anyone!" he screamed. Then he saw Pierre a few meters away from the grating, wearing on his face his mournful expression which he almost never changed. Bateman was quite hysterical. "They're attacking me!" he shouted. "Please open this thing!" "They're only cats," Pierre said. "Besides, I don't know the combination." There was the beginning of a smile tugging at his lips, though his eyes remained pitying. One of the cats nipped Bateman's ankle, and he winced in pain. Pierre turned and started down the path toward the exit. "For heaven's sakes!" Bateman screamed. "Think of Alicia!" Pierre's steps slowed. He appeared to be reconsidering. Bateman gripped the rusty bars of his cage, watching Pierre disappear from sight, and he heard, "Don't worry, Bateman. I'll tell her you'll be late for dinner." My brother Teddy died December 11th, 1999, during our annual family Christmas party. He was 12 and I was 9. I wish I could say it wasn't my fault, but at the end of the day, the whole thing had been my idea. I'm from Woodbury, Minnesota, as is my entire extended family. Every Christmas, my parents would host a holiday party to eat, drink, and gossip. It was always a boring event, but I loved seeing all my cousins. The adults usually stuck us kids in the basement or the loft, but that year, my brother convinced them to let us go sledding at the park instead. We bundled up in our purple Vikings parkas and loaded up the sleds with blankets and our pockets with hand warmer packets. Then me, my brother, and our cousins, Mike and Jeff, set off at the sledding hill, which was about a half-mile down the road. As soon as we were out of view of the house, Teddy stopped. "You guys want to do something fun?" he asked. "Hell yeah, of course." "I want to go sledding," I muttered. "Yeah, well, sledding is for babies," said Jeff. "That's what I was thinking, too," his brother added. Teddy smiled. "Good, because I want to take you guys somewhere way more awesome." "Where are we going?" I asked nervously. "Mom and Dad will get mad if they look for us in the park and we're not there." "They won't look. They're too drunk," Teddy laughed. "But I think we should go to Rocking Horse Creek," he added cruelly. Rocking Horse Creek was actually more of a small river than creek, but it had been called that for as long as I can remember. The creek had been named by neighborhood kids who found an almost life-sized rocking horse sitting abandoned and half submerged in the water. No one knew where it had come from, as no one knew the actual name of the river, because no one had ever been stupid enough to tell their parents that they went there. "But Rocking Horse Creek is almost a half-hour walk from here," I whined. I was already cold and didn't feel like walking that far. Mike snorted. "Don't be a baby. There are extra blankets if you're cold, plus hand warmer packets in your pockets." "Yeah," Jeff added, "and if you want, we can pull you along on the sled just like the baby you are." Mike and Jeff laughed, but Teddy didn't, and he punched Jeff in the arm. "Stop it, you guys. I'm not a baby. And why go to the creek anyway? It's probably ice." "Because it'll look hella cool," Teddy said. "Yeah, I want to go," said Mike. "We could tie our jacket strings to some sticks and go ice fishing." "Yeah." "Well, I'm really good at ice fishing," I lied, "so I have to go so I can help you." "Sure you are," Jeff rolled his eyes. The walk didn't take an hour. It was more like 35 minutes, though it did feel longer due to the cold. When we approached, we saw that the river was indeed frozen over. The ice looked several feet thick, though it was hard to tell. Mike and Jeff were really excited about it and kept testing their weight on the thinner ice of the riverbank. I sat down on my sled and drew a couple of blankets around me. "I'm smaller than them, so I'm colder," I justified to myself. Ted, Mike, and Jeff stood on the riverbank and threw rocks onto the ice to see if they could break it. When they failed to produce even the smallest crack, Jeff announced it was time to play Ricochet Dare. I hated Ricochet Dare. As soon as Jeff suggested it, I felt a cold stone drop in the pit of my stomach. Ricochet Dare was something we'd been playing since we were little kids. The rule stated that if you dared to do something and you didn't do it, the game would end and you would be the new wuss. And this ridicule would go on for weeks or even months. However, if you did go do it, and then you got to dare someone in return. Generally, the dares start off mild, but with every round the stakes get higher. The game would only end when someone inevitably wussed out, and of course, that person was usually me. But not this time, I thought, as I shrugged off my blankets and stood up, pushing my hat up from my eyes. I had to redeem myself and make Teddy proud. I had to show them I wasn't a baby. "Come on," Jeff yelled at me. "You go first." "Okay, what's the dare?" I asked with false bravado. Jeff said. "Okay, you have to take 3 steps out onto the ice." I eyed the frozen river warily. 3 steps? "Yep, and not baby steps, real steps." "Stop it, I'm not a baby." "Then prove it." I took my first step lightly and paid close attention to the give of the slippery mass beneath me. There was none that I could feel, and the ice made no sound of protest underneath my feet. I took the 2 last steps quickly, then turned around and half-skated back to shore. My brother gave me a huge smile and a high five. I dared Mike to take 4.5 steps. Mike dared Ted to do 6 steps. Ted dared Jeff to do 10 steps. And then Jeff dared me to walk all the way to the opposite shore. The ice hadn't made a sound since we started the game, instead remaining as silent as death. Still, there was something unsettling stringing through the cold air and in the silence. I stalled for as long as I could, trying to decide if I should complain. Jeff's dare was actually 2 dares, and I didn't think that was fair. Technically, I would have to do it twice, once to get to the opposite shore and once to get back. I was afraid of falling through to the cold water I knew was raging by under the ice. "Come on, don't be a baby, just do it," Mike said. "Little baby, afraid of the icy-wicey," Jeff mocked. "Stop it, you guys, I'm not a baby. This dare isn't fair. It's 2 dares. My voice was drowned out by Jeff and Mike's mock baby cries. I looked at Teddy for help, but he was laughing. Laughing. My older brother didn't even attempt to stick up for me. He was joining in with them. I felt my lower lip wobble and tears filled my eyes. "Don't cry. Babies cry. You're not a baby." I jerked my head back to the river so they couldn't see my red face and treacherous tears. I felt a sob begin to bubble up through my throat, and I knew I couldn't let them hear it. I would die before I let them see me cry. I took a deep breath and ran across the ice as fast as I could. And for a moment I actually hoped I did fall through. They would be in so much trouble, and they would feel so sorry that they'd made fun of me and called me a baby. With every slap of my foot, I listened for the telltale sound of cracking ice. But none came, and before I knew it, I was on the other side. I raised my fists in the air triumphantly and waited for the cheers. When I turned to look back, they were still standing in a circle together, laughing. They hadn't even been watching me. They missed the entire dare. And I wanted to cry all over again. I swallowed the tears and was about to yell that I wanted to go home. But just then I noticed something dangling from the tree above them. How had I forgotten? I was the only one who had noticed it, and I realized it was my ticket to revenge and redemption. But who to dare? I stood silently watching them as they joked with each other and pointed at each of them in turn, silently mouthing to myself, "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch a tiger by the toe. If he hollers, let him go. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo." My finger landed on Teddy. Good, I thought. He was supposed to be my brother. He deserves it the most. I cleared my throat. "I dare!" I yelled across the small river, interrupting them. They turned to look at me, almost surprised to see me standing on the other shore, so they had forgotten about me. "I dare," I started with renewed anger, "Teddy, to rope swing across the creek and land on this side." There was silence as, in tandem, all three looked up at the rope hanging from the tree above them. During the summer, we would take turns swinging on it and cannonballing into the water, and if you pushed off the tree hard enough, you could actually make it to the other side of the creek. I'd seen my brother do it many times. Teddy's eyes got wide, and he looked at me as if I'd sentenced him to death. Jeff and Mike immediately started prodding him, telling him not to be a wuss. I smiled smugly from the other side of the river. I hoped he'd failed the dare. It'd be just what he deserved. It didn't take much name-calling for Teddy to climb the tree and grab onto the rope. He tested it a few times, then hung on it with all his weight. It held like it always had. "When I get over there, I'm going to dare you to do jumping jacks in the middle of the creek," he yelled at me. That's when I realized my mistake. If Teddy dared me to do that, I would most certainly wuss out, and then they'd tease me until Easter. I sent up a prayer, silent prayer, up to God, that Teddy didn't make it to the other side of the river. "On 3, Mike yelled to Teddy. I watched Teddy count silently to himself, then push off from the tree as hard as he could. He swung in a long, deep arc just like he always did. I watched the scene with my fingers crossed, hoping the rope wouldn't go far enough and they would have to land back on the other riverbank. His dare unfulfilled and the game ended. But I could tell immediately that he was going to make it and somberly stepped backward to make room for him to land. And then suddenly, the loudest sound I've ever heard before or since rang through the air like a gunshot. Teddy broke through as soon as he hit the ice, and the rope and tree branch followed him down into the darkness below. I felt my feet moving under me as I slipped and slid my way out to where he had gone in, sheer panic crushing my chest like a vice. All three of us were on our bellies, groping for the angry, jagged hole within 10 seconds. We searched the watery void, but all we could feel was the tree branch below us. Within a minute, we couldn't feel anything at all. Our hands and arms had gone numb. Jeff pulled Mike and I to our feet and started running for the sleds. "Leave his sled here. We need to get out of here now." I felt cold and dead. I stumbled blindly toward the sound of my cousin's voice. "We need to save Teddy. I want Teddy. He's in the ice. You have to get Mom and Dad." But I was blubbering so badly by the end that I doubt they understood a word of it. And despite my slurred protests, I followed them into the woods, confused and cold. But after a while, I couldn't feel the cold anymore. I couldn't feel any pain in my heart or my body. In fact, I couldn't feel anything at all. Mike didn't say a word for the entire walk back, but Jeff went on and on about the plan. We would just say that Teddy decided to go home before us, and that he had said he was going to take a shortcut through the woods, the other woods on the far side of the road. I just nodded for a while, even smiled at his plan. God, to this day I don't know why I smiled. We were almost home by the time I began to process what he was saying. "No, I have to tell Dad to save Teddy," I told him. I was surprised by how flat my voice sounded. Mike just kept walking forward in a daze, but Jeff whirled around on me. "It's too late to save him, but you can save yourself. It's your fault that this happened because it was your dare. They will take you to jail for murder and put you on death row. It's an open and shut case. You can't tell anyone, ever, anything." And I don't know why I believed him, but I did. The hardest part of the day wasn't watching my brother die or the long, cold walk home. The hardest part by far was pretending like nothing was wrong when we got there. "What do you mean you haven't seen Teddy? He should have been back by now. He started home an hour before us." I couldn't keep my poker face for very long, though, and I started to cry. My dad thought it was because I was so cold that my skin had begun to turn to white. Search and Rescue searched the wrong woods for the next 24 hours because they believed our story. The sledding hill had been crowded that day, but a couple of people were sure they'd seen us there. The day after that, they intended to search the other side of the forest, the side Teddy was actually on, but a blizzard rolled in overnight and that search was called off. My parents were told that wherever Teddy was, he was almost certainly dead. Parents in the neighborhood stopped letting their children play in the woods, even in the summer. My own parents wouldn't let me leave the house for a year. I grew up angry and spiteful. I hated everyone, but no one more than myself. I applied to college just to get away from my parents, whose constant love and support felt vile and wrong to me. I wished they'd have had another kid so they could give their love to someone deserving and stop talking about Teddy all the time. I got into the U of M. My grades sucked and I drank a lot. My parents pressured me to excel since I was their last horse in the race. I never returned their calls or emails. I lived with the guilt. Just barely, but I lived with it. If nothing else, I could take a bit of pride in the fact that I was surviving. Drunkenly one night, I finally told a couple of my close friends about it. They agreed that it wasn't my fault that shit happens, and Teddy wouldn't want me to dwell on it. I made the dare, but he climbed the rope. That night was a turning point for me. After being validated by people who actually knew the truth, I cut back on the drinking and I picked up my grades for the last 2 semesters, and somehow it was enough to graduate. A year later, I got an invitation to an engagement party at my parents' house. Cousin Jeff was getting married to a girl he'd met in the Navy, and I was invited to celebrate their love with them. As much as I always hated going back home, I wanted to support Jeff. Somehow, just knowing that he was living a full life despite our shared burden made me feel hopeful, like I could too. The party was quieter and more reserved than the parties my parents threw when we were kids. They had become less fun since Teddy's death, more refined, more somber. Jeff was quieter than I remembered too, but he was clearly happy with his new fiancée, who seemed like a very nice girl. And though a wide smile was spread across his face, his eyes betrayed a certain guardedness, especially when he looked at me. I got up the courage to talk to him only once. We shared an awkward hug, and I congratulated him on the engagement and asked him about his brother. Jeff told me that Mike was addicted to heroin and living in Arizona somewhere. I said that it seemed Mike had never really recovered. Jeff said he didn't know what I was talking about and walked away. I spent the rest of the party hugging relatives, making small talk, and pretending to drink. Sobriety is suspect in my family. After a while, I went outside to take in a cigarette and a moment of peace, and in the secrecy of the autumn air, I started to cry. This party should be boisterous and loud. My parents should be lively and laughing. Mike should be running around the party, daring people to take mystery shots. I should be cheerfully telling stories from college and talking about my plans for graduate school. And Teddy should be here instead of lying dead at the bottom of a riverbed. I flicked my cigarette under my car and wiped the wetness from my cheeks. I knew what I had to do and where I had to go. I had to see the river that had haunted me since I was 9. Had anyone been back to Rocking Horse Creek? Was Teddy's sled still there? Had they replaced the rope? Had the creek dried up? This was my worst fear. It had secrets I didn't want to live to see revealed. I lit another cigarette as I walked and began to list all the reasons that this was a bad idea. I spent the hike either begging myself to find the strength to turn around or begging for the courage to continue on. I arrived at Teddy's grave before I was ready. The creek was loud and the water was moving quickly. Recent rain in the area to blame, no doubt. The rocking horse itself was in bad shape. Only its head was visible above the water now, and it was so rotted you could barely tell what it was anymore. No one had replaced the rope. I sat down next to the creek and took it all in. It was hard to believe this was the same place from which I still woke up screaming. It seemed to have healed since taking Teddy's life. If it could heal, maybe I could heal too. The tree was so full you wouldn't think it ever lost a single branch. The creek innocently bubbled by, full of life and vigor. Everything here was so different than I remembered, even the rocking horse. Where the toy had once been cheerful, almost animated, it was now just a morbid, misshapen head. Its eyes were pointed directly at me, and they bore a soulless stare right through me. It sent an involuntary shudder through my body, and I turned away from the horse's head in revulsion. I immediately saw what the horse had been looking at, a sliver of red plastic jutting out from the ground behind me. Teddy's sled. My reaction was visceral, and I had to lean over and vomit in the grass beside me. It was real. It had happened. Had I been pretending it wasn't real? Was that why I had really come here? To pretend that the past was gone and didn't matter anymore? How could I forget that what this place really was? I stumbled to my feet and began walking down the riverbank away from the buried sled, pausing every few feet to dry heave. I just wanted to get away from it, that thing that was all that remained of my brother. Everything that used to be Teddy laid at the bottom of the river now. I pulled a cigarette from my pack with a shaking hand. As I tried to light it, I tripped over something and fell forward, my cigarette rolling down the riverbank and into the water. It was a rope, and I knew right away that it was Teddy's rope. I kicked it away from me. It was worse than the sled. If I had anything left to throw up, I know I would have. The end of the rope lay deteriorating on the riverbank, with the length of it disappearing into the murky water of the river. And maybe, I am morbid, or sick or crazy, but I suddenly decided that I wanted to know. I wanted to see. I crawled over to it and picked it up. I felt just as it did all those summers ago when I used to swing from it into the water as Teddy clapped from the shoreline. I began to pull the rope out of the river. The water was fast-moving and the rope was heavy. The creek didn't want to give up its secrets so easily, and it rebelled against my efforts. Still, I pulled harder. Just as I felt I was coming to the end of it, something long and thin breached the surface of the river. I saw it for only a moment before the rotted rope snapped and it sank back into the dark abyss. I almost dove in after it, but as I stood on the riverbank, my brain screaming at me, I realized what I'd almost done. What if that was Teddy? Would I want to see? Breaking from my trance, I hurled the rest of the rope into the river and fled into the woods. My lungs struggled to draw breath, and the trees began to spin around me. I anxiously lit another cigarette and let the shudders rack through my body as I waited for the nicotine to calm me. I stood there in the middle of the woods, the rope 20 feet behind me at the bottom of the river, and took short drags off my cigarette. And when my breathing had become bearable again, I felt someone watching me. It was Teddy, of course. He sat with his back against a tree, faded purple parka still bright in the mid-afternoon sun, and in some parts bleached almost as white as his bones. Ripped foil from an opened hand-warmer pocket was clutched in his hand, still remaining after all these years. He stared at me accusingly. The deep eye sockets of his skull were somehow not empty. Instead, they held a knowing consciousness that he knew what we had done. We knew we'd left him to die. But we hadn't known that, Teddy. We hadn't. We didn't know you crawled out of the river. We didn't know you were freezing to death as we ran home to bury our secrets. We would have saved you, Teddy, if we had known. You know that. We would have saved you. I yelled at this skeleton. In my head, or out loud, I'm not entirely sure. But Teddy just sits there staring at me. 30 yards from the rocking horse, 20 yards from the broken tree. And I know he'll sit here forever because Jeff and Mike don't need to know that our sins are far more terrible than we'd ever thought. I know it's only my burden to bear, and I can tell, as he watches me in the fading sunlight, that Teddy agrees. The doctor told me it was a figment of my imagination, a hallucination, a phantom limb, cut off, but the ghost of a feeling remains. The doctor tooted and prescribed me a different pill. I've lost count of how many pills I've tried. There was the yellow one, and the red and white capsule, and the green one. They have succeeded in giving me incontinence, nausea, and hair loss. But they haven't taken away my girl. My doctor told me to talk about it, tell people. What the hell am I supposed to tell something like this? My last friends abandoned me when Sylvia left. It's late here. It's just me and no sleep. Where to start? Oh, where there's so much to tell. At the beginning, I suppose, it's always a good place. We thought we had it made when we moved into the suburbs. We had well-paying jobs. Fluke or competence had saved us when the waves of cuts hit around 2010. For once in our lives, money wasn't a problem. 8 years earlier, we had Annabelle, Belle for short. She was our little angel. Parents out there will know. A child shifts the center of gravity of your life. The move was good for her. Good for us, away from the bustle and hustle and danger of the city. Busy streets, missing children, the sticky hands and staring eyes of sexual predators. It wasn't the house of our dreams, but it was close enough. A lawn for the balmy summer months, fireplace for the chill of winter, space for us to grow into, especially for a young girl. It came fully furnished, and it was a steal. A distressed sale, our agent called it. At least a tenth off with a similar property would set us back. The euphoria and novelty lasted me till the first night. Sylvia was asleep next to me. The moonlight sparkled off the fine hairs of her bare shoulder. We shared a celebratory drink after dinner, and then after that, another. And I was lying in bed, basking in the warm glow of alcohol, when I first heard it. My first thought was rats. That was exactly what it sounded like, the little tap dance of tiny claws on hardwood coming from the walls. The delicate snoring from next to me told me that Sylvia was undisturbed by the scratching noise coming from the walls. I flinched as my bare feet touched the cold floor. The floorboards groaned in protest as I padded across the room like an overweight ninja. The tapping paused at the first creak of the floorboards, then resumed. The rough weave of the wallpaper under my palm as I leaned in to track the pitter-patter behind the walls. Scampering sounds eluded me. Every time I attempted to track the rats, the sounds seemed to come from another part of the room. My knees grew sore from pressure. I wasn't some young child at a playground. I was a grown man, and my weight pressed down on the bony points of my kneecaps. Out of desperation, I put my ear to the wall, hoping that the source of the little noises would reveal itself to me. I was only met with a stubborn silence, or almost a stubborn silence. On the edge of my hearing, so quiet that I had to strain my ears to pick it up, a child's laughter from inside the walls. I did not speak of the incident. I spent more time trying to convince myself that there hadn't been that childish giggle. Wind, perhaps, the rattle of a toy. Not a rattle, maybe one of those newfangled dolls with those soulless eyes and microchip voice. There was a change in her, like the heavy air you can smell before a thunderstorm. She was a little quieter than usual. A strange environment will do that to a kid, a little withdrawn. Sylvia didn't really notice. I suppose I'd always been more observant than her. Belle started looking tired, dark crescents appearing under her light hazel eyes. She wasn't getting much sleep. My first instinct was to blame the rats in the walls. Who wouldn't? They got louder and louder as the days went by. The damn things were keeping me up at night. It seemed that the sounds progressed from simple scratchings to thumps, almost as though the cursed rodents were hurling themselves bodily against my walls. The thumping started sounding eerily like footsteps. I was not about to be defeated by a group of jumped-up rats in my own house. Fueled by testosterone-induced rage, I waged war. I tried glue traps. I tried poison. I tried cages. Nothing worked. I asked Sylvia about it, but she seemed oblivious to the late-night disturbances. That woman could sleep through a hurricane. I asked Belle if the noise was keeping her up at night. Sylvia was over in the living room watching TV while Belle and I did the dishes. She just looked up with those big eyes of hers. The other children want to come in and play, but they can't open the door. The girl always had an overactive imagination, but this one hit a little too close to home for me. I felt the unfamiliar prickle of gooseflesh on my arm. "You mean the door to the house?" I asked, keeping my tone deliberately playful. It was a game, just another of her little games. I had imaginary friends at that age. Why should my own child have been any different? "No, Daddy. The door behind the cupboard." The opening theme from Desperate Housewives floated up through the floorboards, whirled away. I thought I'd humor my little girl, but there was something deathly serious in her tone that I could not shake. I reached back around the standalone wardrobe and felt nothing more than the smooth paint on the wall. "There's no door there, honey." "Look closer," she insisted. I held up my cell phone for light, still playing along. There was something strange in that palm width of space between the cupboard and the wall. A discoloration of the wall, perhaps something darker in the shade of the wardrobe. The hard edges of the wardrobe bit into the soft flesh of my fingers. I put my back into it, and the piece of furniture gave ground grudgingly. And there it was. A door behind the wardrobe, just as Belle had said. Not any door, though. I ran my fingers over the smooth surface of a wall. Just a painted one. So convincing were the brush strokes on the door that I had to touch the wall again to tell myself that it wasn't real. "How'd you know this was here, baby bear?" I asked. "The other children told me." "From school?" As far as I knew, she hadn't brought friends home before. "No, Daddy, the children from behind the door," she said. I looked into her tawny eyes, hoping to spot some twinkle of mischief there. There was nothing there but an innocent earnestness. I lay in bed that night, studying the cracks in the ceiling. My heart pounded hard in my chest, a heavy bass line above the distant rumble of the heating. My daughter's words had unsettled me in a strange way I could not pinpoint. It felt off somehow, like a surrealist painting, one tiny detail throwing my carefully ordered world into disarray. I took no deep breaths, trying to drive away that strange, tight fear in my chest. The odd painted door, a mural of some sort? Why was it still there when the room had been so clearly repainted? The thumping of the rats in the walls sounding so much like little footsteps. "The children from behind the door," she said. I rubbed at my forearms vigorously, trying to press the goosebumps back down into my skin. That's when the thumping started again. Not rats, I realized. Not rats at all. Footsteps. The light bounce of a child. I crept up to my wall again, pressing my ear against the wallpaper. There was laughter there, faint and soft. Not the laughter of a single child. Children. Their happy footfalls beating a rough drumbeat on the wooden floor. There was someone else in there with my daughter. My heart jumped. I felt the chill in my veins as I rushed out of my room and tore down the corridor. The silvery light of the moon shone through the window. It gave everything an odd, flat look without contrast. Belle's room was only a few feet from the door to our bedroom, but my chest heaved with deep, body-shaking breaths. I could still hear them faintly through the door, the thud of their feet on the floor. I steeled myself. It was nothing. Sound traveled strangely through these old houses. Echoes, maybe. She was just talking to herself in her sleep, the stress of moving, perhaps. Suitably calmed, I turned the doorknob slowly. There was a conspiratorial shush from the other side of the door, and silence descended like a shroud. I gave the door a gentle push. The room was dark and quiet. The moonlight crept into the room. My daughter was standing there, just behind the door, a still figure against a dark background. The shock took the strength from my legs. I backed away a little quicker than I meant to. She stood there, swaying slightly. Thin white crescents showed from under her hooded eyelids. Her lips were moving, almost soundlessly. I leaned forward, straining to make out what she was saying. It slowly became clear. One sentence, over and over. "All the doors are open now. All the doors are open." And from behind her, in the shadowed room, the quiet click of a door shutting. Belle didn't recall a thing the next morning. She could sense my frustration and fear as I quizzed her about the night before. Dark circles framed puzzled eyes in her pale face. She hadn't slept well that night either. Sylvia took her to school. I hadn't broached the topic with Sylvia yet. There was still some time before I had to leave for the office. I crept back into my daughter's room, feeling like a thief in my own empty house. I stood there in front of that strange painted door for the second time in as many days. I ran my fingers around its edges, remembering the strange sound of the door shutting from the night before. Its edges were wholly contiguous with the wall. I pulled the wardrobe out further, putting my entire frame between the wardrobe and the door and leaning into it. There was no give, no yielding of the door. It was just painted over a wall as solid as any other. I was about to go when I heard an unfamiliar rasp under my foot. The floor was gritty with some kind of dust. I knelt down and pinched some of the dust up between 2 fingers. All the doors are open now. My daughter's dreamy voice in my ear, my memory of it so sharp that it seemed that she was right there whispering it. How odd it was for the dust to be pink. Of course it would be. It wasn't dust at all, it was paint. Paint from the wall. Things didn't get better. The gambling footsteps continued at night unabated. That and the whispers and the giggles at night. Whatever was in my daughter's room toyed with me. It never let Sylvia hear it. I'd stay up, waiting to wake my wife up just in time to hear it, only to be met with a stubborn silence. Trickery wouldn't work either. We stayed up late to catch a DVD long into the small hours of the night, but the house remained quiet. The laughter from the next room was always tantalizingly distant. The happy sounds of children at play, as though from a great distance. Too great a distance to be in the room next to mine. Belle was in high spirits, but she was wasting away. Sylvia hadn't noticed it yet, but I felt it in the sharp bones of her shoulders, pressing into my arms when I hugged her, or her skinny arms that I could almost encircle with my thumb and forefinger. I received an email from her teacher mentioning that Belle still wasn't integrating well at school. He said that Belle was perpetually tired in class, and she had blamed late-night games of tag and hide-and-seek with her friends for her tiredness. You need to exercise more control over your girl, he said. I had to know what was going on. Sylvia was already asleep. The nightly visits hadn't started yet. I slid into Belle's room silently, an open packet of flour in my hand. I scattered it all around the floor, taking care not to step into the flour myself. I lay back in my bed with a sigh, waiting for the sounds to start. Sleep took me unexpectedly, but what little I had was fitful and restless. I woke with a snort at first, light. It was Saturday, and it would be some time yet before the rest of the world woke. I stretched under the covers, my back popping satisfyingly. I blinked the sleep from my eyes. The flour. I had to check the flour. I swung my feet off the bed and planted them on the floor, right next to a pair of white speckled footprints, just where they would be if someone was standing over my bed, staring at me. That damnable chill stole the warmth of the morning sun from my skin. My hands clenched and unclenched spastically like dying spiders. I stared at the trail of flour-marked footprints from my open door. How long had she stood there in the dark watching me sleep, I wondered. I stood up on shaky legs, my hand on the wall to support myself down the corridor. Belle's door was ajar. It swung open silently. The sound of deep breathing told me that Belle was still asleep. There was but a single set of footprints, just starting from her bed, where her feet would have landed if she got off. No multiple footprints, just a single set for my daughter. Typical somnambulism, perhaps. The stress of the move, the new school, could have brought it on. She'd never sleepwalked before, but who knew what dark things lurked in her psyche? I heaved a sigh of relief, chastising myself for a week's worth of irrationality. How reassuring the illusion of normalcy in our lives, and how quickly it shatters. Not with a roar or a flash, with something simple. Something simple like my daughter's shoe bouncing off my toe as I tried to leave the room, flipping once, twice, and coming to rest to a hollow in the flour on the floor. The size, the shoe, the prints. It didn't fit. It didn't match. Whatever had gotten off the bed had stood next to me the night before. It wasn't Belle. After that cruel prank, the noises at night returned unabated. The strangeness started to leak. The night was no longer its sole province. I was waiting for Belle outside the upstairs toilet another Saturday morning, when I heard the familiar taunting voices start up over the sound of the shower. A chorus of children's voices saying something with a strange cadence, a chant almost. Stay. They seemed to say, stay, stay, stay. They were in there. There was no way for them to escape. I found the door unlocked. I turned the knob, braced my legs, and threw the door open, and found nothing. Hot water still gushed from the shower head. Steam billowed out into the cooler air of the corridor. No one was there. I'd seen her go in. I would have wagered my life on it. And yet she was gone. The giggling started again, coming down the corridor, mocking. Her room. I bolted down the corridor. I found her there, a towel wrapped around her bare body, staring at me with a cold mirth from her bed. Her dripping hair had left a trail of water on the wooden floor, a trail which led to the wall with the painted door. I felt her eyes trailing me as I left the room. I shut the shower off, looking for how my daughter and the voices had escaped the tiny toilet. It took a minute. Like the picture with the young lady that turned into an old crone, the answer was right there in front of me. Sketched out between the towels in front of me in bold strokes of dark mildew was the vague outline of a door. It was another sleepless night. I thought long and hard about trying to explain everything to Sylvia. It sounded crazy. There were doors in the walls, doors that our daughter had walked through, doors let in something strange into our house, something that wanted her to stay. The thought lingered in the back of my head like a superlative scab, itchy and red and raw. Sleep would not come easy. I was contemplating a little chemical assistance to aid me along my way when I grew aware of a soft sliding sound. Movement caught my eye. I saw a slim figure slowly shuffle by the door to our bedroom. "Belle," I called out to her softly. She didn't break step. And what a step it was, a stiff-armed and stiff-legged march down the corridor, her feet scraping over the wooden floor. "Belle," I called out, a little louder. There was no response. I got out of bed and tiptoed to the door. The door to the toilet clicked shut softly. I followed. The lights revealed an empty corridor. The toilet door yielded a squeak of complaint. The silence was thick and cloying. It seemed that no sound would carry through the air. The light clicked to life in the toilet. Shadows leapt and danced with its first few flickers. The shower curtain swayed. The draft I had let in when I opened the door, I told myself. It did not help. I chided myself for my childish fears, but the flutter in my gut remained. I yanked the curtain aside roughly, my other hand balled into a fist to protect myself. From what? My daughter? Nothing awaited me on the other side of the curtain. Nothing but that strange outline of a door etched out in lines with tiles. I heaved a sigh of relief. Perhaps the lack of sleep was getting me. My fears spilling into waking dreams. The calm was short-lived. I heard another door slam shut. Downstairs. A series of childish titters carried up through the floorboards. I bolted downstairs. Again, the lights revealed nothing, almost nothing. The huge throw rug that had come with the furnished house had been tossed aside. There, hidden under it, was another door, scratched into the parquet flooring. I felt sick to my stomach thinking of the days we spent on the couch with our feet on that hideous thing. I ran my fingers around the grooves of the scratch marks. The door felt cool to the touch, cooler than the surrounding wood. The same feel of a front door guarding against the winter chill. Whatever it was that the door guarded against, it was cold, very cold. The laughter started again, taunting, mocking. I heard the creak of my daughter's footsteps on the stairs to the basement. The light of the living room seemed to shy away from the depths of the basement. I could make out Belle's outline just where the light of the living room met the darkness of the basement. The light switch was at the foot of the stairs. The steps sagged under my weight. Belle didn't turn around. I reached out to grab her shoulder. Her bony shoulder was icy cold. I pulled her towards me. I could just nearly see her face. Something blotted out the light. I blinked at the silhouette at the top of the staircase. "Daddy, why are all the lights on?" Belle's voice. Oh, God. Belle was at the top of the stairs. I felt the light caress of fingers on my hand, the girl in front of me, her fingers on mine. Her voice was a hoarse whisper, as though forced from a throat long turned to dust. "She's ours now," she giggled, and twisted away from my grasp, vanishing into the dark. The dark space under the house suddenly filled with a patter of feet on the dusty floor. 2 pairs, 3 pairs, until it seemed that an entire legion of light feet were dancing across the floor. The sound was deafening in that confined space. I reached forward and thumbed a light switch, only to be greeted by silence and the slowly settling dust. Something was wrong with the wall again. I already knew what to expect. With a sweep of my hand, I cleared the dust from the wall. Just as I expected, another door. This one, a huge set of double doors, painted on the wall with garish colors. Just before I left the basement, I saw the clean circles on the floor where the opening had just swept the dust away. We had to go. There was something dark in the house, something wholly unnatural about those strange painted doors. I sprinted up the stairs. "Grab some clothes," I told Belle as I passed her. I did not stop to see if there was a shred of understanding in her black eyes. She turned and followed me silently upstairs. I shook Sylvia awake roughly. 4 weeks to the day we moved in, and we were fleeing our own home. She blinked asleep from her eyes. In hushed tones, I tried to explain the situation to her. The painted doors, the sound of children, the danger we were all in. Her expression slowly changed from sleepy bewilderment to one of disbelief and annoyance. She told me that I was overreacting and that the stress of the move and our job was taking its toll on me. We would talk about it in the morning, she said. Get help from a doctor if we needed to. I grew increasingly agitated at her apathy. I begged her to humor me for just one night, for our family to shift to a motel for a single evening. Our conversation grew heated. All this was cut short when Belle reappeared at our doorway. Her hair was wild, her eyes burning with some inner fire. You should go now. All the doors are closing soon. I must stay with them. Her voice was toneless, the flat delivery of an atheist reciting a litany. Sylvia gaped. Having her daughter acting as strangely as her husband tipped her over the edge. Weeping, she rushed forward and held Belle close to her. You're not going anywhere. This isn't real. Daddy's sick. He's made you sick too. You and I will get away from here. Get away from Daddy. Those words felt like physical blows. I felt sick. My wife started pulling at Belle's hand, trying to move her. Belle stood fast, and there was nothing my wife, with her advantages in strength and weight, could do to shift her an inch. Sensing their prey about to invade them, the things in the house grew restless. Our rooms filled with the sound of feet on the floor, the sound of little feet running up and down the corridors. With a squeak, Sylvia pulled the door shut and leaned against it. The door shuddered on its hinges as unseen things flung themselves against it. Unsuccessful, the house grew silent. Sylvia stared at the doorknob. I shook my head, stepping off the bed. I had just gotten onto my feet when a new horror showed itself. Our wall was stretching, distending like a boil, bulging obscenely toward us. There was a door in our room, under the wallpaper. It had been there all along. Sylvia began to sob, big, hiccuping sobs of fear. We heard the tearing sound of the glue ripping off the walls. The blister of the wall took shape. I saw the hard edge of the door pressing, straining against the wallpaper. And behind that, the sharp points of fingers pressing against outwards. Many, many pairs of hands, and then a rip. A pale finger burst through the thick wallpaper. It hooked downwards and began to tear at the fabric. Sylvia and I were transformed by the sight, paralyzed by fear. Sylvia screamed as Belle tore herself free from her mother's grasp. Belle took another step forward and placed her hand on the light switch. In that moment, I saw my daughter again. For the last time. Her eyes sparkled with tears. Don't look. You don't want to see them. I love you. With a flick of her wrist, she plunged the room into total darkness. The sound of the wallpaper ripping was very loud. The temperature in the room fell. It felt larger somehow, that we weren't in the bedroom of our home anymore, but in some vast and empty space. A chill wind blew, and it smelt of dry dust. When the wind died down, we were alone in our room. Our girl was gone. What is there left to say after that? We did what we could. We moved into a motel. The police came. They looked for prints. They asked questions. They took pictures. They broke down the walls behind the doors with their hammers. Nothing. The detectives came. They asked more questions. Hard questions sometimes. They took me away for a while. The doctors came. They cajoled and counseled. They asked me about my parents, about our family, if I had ever hurt my daughter. The doctors found nothing wrong with me. The cops found nothing in my house. The detectives found nothing false in our story. They let me go. Sylvia and I stayed with her parents for a month. Belle's disappearance ripped a hole in our lives. We tried. Some things just don't heal right. Other things don't heal at all. Things just weren't the same. The split was amicable. We just drifted. No arguments, no fights. Just a slow death of the love that had once bound us. And what then? I came back here. There was nowhere else I could go. The first night was the hardest. The bedroom was out of the question. I spent the first night on the couch hugging a bottle of Jack. It was midnight when the laughter woke me. They were still there in the house. Through the tinkling of the laughter, I could pick out just one single voice. A father never forgets the voice of his child. The doors were gone, but they were still there. She was still there. I'll stop here for the night. I can hear her again. She sounds happy.
Those who dream by day are cognizant of many things that escape those who dream only at night. Edgar Allan Poe, Eleonora. Go to bed and wait for the Sandman. Even as it came out of James' mouth, it seemed to him a strange thing to say, and he was not sure why he had. But for some reason it worked. Daniel went to bed. The next morning, though, he asked, "What does the Sandman look like?" James was making breakfast. Daniel sat at the table, short legs swinging under his chair. "Nothing really," James said. "It's just an expression." "What does it mean?" "Just something people say." He put a plate of eggs in front of Daniel and kissed him on the top of his head. He thought that would be the end of it, until he saw the Sandman for himself. He was getting ready for bed and stopped by Daniel's room to check on him while he slept, as he often did. It was such a routine precaution that when he saw a pale, naked man sitting on the edge of Daniel's bed, rocking back and forth, it took a moment for him to process what he was seeing. He reacted the way any father would, of course. He ran into the room, screaming, and for a moment he thought about attacking the intruder, but then the man on the bed turned, and that's when James saw that it wasn't really a man. It was a pale, slithery thing, hairless and warped. Its joints turned the wrong way, and its body out of shape with itself. When it moved, it was like an insane marionette dancing on a stage. James froze. The skittering thing watched him. He felt spreading warmth, and he realized he'd pissed his pants. Only when he remembered that Daniel was still there in bed, staring at the broken-shaped thing sitting a foot away, did he regain the courage to move. He grabbed Daniel and ran. In the hall, he turned to see if the thing would follow him, but it didn't. For a moment it watched, and then, moving like a stop-motion nightmare, it crawled to the window and jumped out, leaving only the billowing curtains to mark its passing. James had trouble talking to the police. He reported a break-in, but when asked to describe the intruder, he didn't know what to say. How could he make the ordinary man in the blue uniform sitting at his kitchen table while two of his colleagues searched the house understand a thing like he'd seen? He couldn't even understand it himself. To make it worse, Daniel's memory did not correspond to James.
He described an ordinary-looking burglar. A man in a mask, he said. James thought about it. Had it been a mask? No. It would have had to have been a full costume, and an elaborate one, something like they would use for a movie, and that would not explain the way it moved. But in the end, he simply echoed his son's testimony. Yeah, a man in a mask, he said. A burglar. The lie unsettled him almost as much as what had happened. The doctors said Daniel wasn't hurt and showed no signs of molestation. James was relieved. They stayed at a motel for a couple of nights until they felt ready to come home, and then James had a new security system installed, along with bars on the windows. He didn't like the sight of them in Daniel's room, but it seemed like the only thing to do. James was frightened that first night back in the house, but Daniel, strangely, was not. When asked if he felt okay sleeping alone, he just said yes. In the end, it was James who found himself wishing he were not sleeping alone. He was up all night listening for the sound of anything moving in the house. Although he had convinced himself that his memory was faulty and that it had been a normal, albeit probably deeply disturbed man in his son's room, when he closed his eyes even for a moment, he pictured bloodless skin and a twisted, inhuman face. He found himself wondering, why my house? Why my family? He knew, of course, that there didn't have to be a reason, but still, he wondered. 2 weeks later, Daniel stopped talking. James didn't notice at first. Kids went through quiet phases sometimes. But eventually, he tried to get Daniel to talk, and he wouldn't. Eventually, it became clear that he couldn't. Back to the doctor they went. Nothing wrong with him that we can see, was the diagnosis. Was it the trauma? James asked. Could be, they said. Sometimes these things come on late. Children can be a mystery even to those who know them best. They recommended a child psychologist whom James couldn't afford. He could not, for that matter, even afford the bill they were giving him now. Nothing seemed to help. Daniel would write out answers to questions sometimes, but never more than a yes or a no. When James would ask him what was wrong, or if he'd seen or heard anything that frightened him, Daniel would only stare. He seemed furtive and bemused. James found himself missing the sound of his son's voice. Sometimes he wanted to hear it so bad that he ached. But it seemed that Daniel would not talk again until he was ready. James had other things to worry about, too. He was convinced, beyond reason, that the intruder was not really gone. Though the alarm never went off and the locks and the bars remained undisturbed, he was sure that he had heard movement in the night. Not normal movement. It was a sound like a huge snake slithering through the house. When he heard it, he imagined horrible things. Nothing was ever there when he went to investigate, though he often thought he glimpsed something just out of the corner of his eye, a pale foot or a misshapen shadow that would slink away as soon as he turned. He rarely slept, and when he did, he had haunted dreams. Soon he realized he had not left the house in weeks except to go to the bank and buy groceries. He felt hemmed in. With Daniel acting mute, he hadn't had an actual conversation with anyone in weeks, so he called his mother. The connection was bad, and her voice sounded faint, on the verge of being there not at all. "I guess I'm okay, Ma," he said, pausing to wipe the sweat from his palms, and then make sure he could hear Daniel playing in the next room. "But things have been a little rough. We had a break-in." "Oh, how awful," Mom said. "Did they take anything?" "No, just ran off. It was weird, though. I haven't really felt comfortable since then." "Are you still working at the hospital?" "No, Ma. I left last year. You know that." "Oh, well, have you been getting out? What about that nice woman you were seeing last year? The one who played the piano?" James scowled. She was always asking that kind of thing. Didn't she know how hard it was being a single father? That he didn't have the time? He was about to say so when something made him pause. Ma, is there somebody else on the line? I don't think so. James was sure he heard it, though. The short, gasping sound of someone trying to hold their breath and failing. A cold feeling crept across the back of his neck. You're sure nobody is listening on the other phone? Dear, there is no other phone. I'm on the cell phone. That's why the service is so bad. Then what is... James stopped. If the sound wasn't coming from her end, then... He dropped the phone and raced across the hall. The extension hung on its hook undisturbed. Heart pounding, he hurtled into the garage. The spare phone sat on the workbench. No one was in sight. But could they have been? Could someone have been there all along, listening to his phone call and then slithered away? Might they be here even now? The next day, he took out the extra phone extensions. He even filled the jacks with rubber cement. Daniel watched him work, eyes curious, but James offered no explanation. He began giving Daniel a light physical exam every week. His CNA training was a little rusty after a year on disability, but you never really forgot. It was an absurd thing to do, of course. Even if there was a physical cause for Daniel's behavior, it would be nothing he could discover this way. And he was sure on some level that it was compulsive behavior. Nevertheless, it made him feel better. One morning, James set the diaphragm of the stethoscope against Daniel's chest, but he could not locate a heartbeat. He moved his hand in search of the right spot to no avail. Then, to test it, he listened to his own heartbeat. It came through, steady and clear, but when he checked Daniel again, he didn't hear anything. A thought came, unbidden to him, of the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz, whose chest was as empty as a kettle. A sick feeling roiled his stomach. He threw the stethoscope down and grabbed Daniel by the shoulders, looking into his face. Daniel stared back with bright eyes. He even smiled a little, with the corners of his mouth. James felt a tingle of tears. He swept his son up in his arms and hugged him, and Daniel hugged back. Then James put his shirt back on him and sent him to play. The stethoscope, he decided, was broken. He threw it in the trash. Things got worse. James' terrors were no longer relegated to the long hours of the night. Now it seemed that some creeping, some skittering and scuttling, some unknowable noise in some dark corner or another filled every second of his day. The thought of how big the house really was started to weigh on him. There were so many rooms he wasn't in at any given time, so many places someone or something else could be. He imagined strange figures occupying the rest of his home when he wasn't around, melting into the walls or merging with the shadows whenever he turned on a light or opened a door. How would he know if they were there? How would he ever know? Soon he didn't even have to be outside of a room to imagine it. When he walked up the stairs, he pictured pale figures looking beneath him. When he went down the hall, he pictured a crawling thing slithering behind the walls, shadowing his every step. If he sat too long in the same chair, he imagined that it was right behind him. And he never comforted when he turned around and found nothing there, as he could only guess that meant it had moved swiftly and silently behind him once again. Wherever he was, not looking right now, that was where he imagined it to be. He was losing his mind, he knew. The only thing that helped him cling to sanity was that Daniel seemed undisturbed. Other than his muteness, his behavior was perfectly normal, and whenever he seemed to sense that his father was troubled, he would hug him, or squeeze his hand, or even smile. Sometimes, when he left the room, James cried. One night, he found himself creeping around the house with no lights on at 2 o'clock in the morning. If the intruding thing had taken to violating his daytime activities, then he would get revenge by confronting it on its own terms, the night. And really, night was no more frightening to him now than day. They were almost interchangeable. He padded barefoot down the halls, up the stairs, in and out of disused rooms. Sometimes he stopped to listen, hoping to locate it by sound. It was stealthy, creeping thing. He knew, but it was awkward at times, and it couldn't always keep its strangely shaped limbs from making their distinct, irregular footsteps. The smallest noise would give it away. There was one room he suspected it spent most of its time in, the spare bedroom. Not a bedroom at all, really, more like a closet, just large enough to accommodate a bed if one were so inclined. It was unpainted and uncarpeted and drafty. He'd always meant to fix it up. He didn't come in here very often because he disliked the bare, unused look of it. It made him think of a partially dissected corpse. He came in now, though. If the thing made its nest any one place in the house, this would be it. Of course, there was nothing there now, but that didn't mean there was nothing there. He cursed, running a hand through his sweat-damp hair. What was he missing? How did it hide from him? What was its secret? He peered into the room's empty corners one by one, getting his face a few inches from the plaster and floorboards so that he could be certain that there was no place and no space for it to conceal itself. The light bulb flickered. He froze. My God, he thought. It's on the ceiling. He pictured it crawling above him like a huge pale lizard. That's how it gets around, he thought. That's how it escapes. Every time I should have it cornered, it just scuttles up the wall and hides right over my head. He imagined it dangling down behind him like a spider. If I turn around, he thought, it will be there, hanging with its face right next to mine. He held his breath. He did not want to turn around, but he had no choice. It was between him and the door. With a quiet sob, he rounded on his heels. Of course, he was alone. There was no man on the ceiling. He checked twice. Maybe it crawled out and was waiting for him in the hall, but when he checked there, the coast was once again clear. It should have been a relief, but it was not. After all, it had to be in here somewhere. If the ceiling was not its trick, that just meant it was somewhere else. Something else. Something even more strange, even more clever. He went to Daniel's room. He had not stopped checking on him at night like he always had. This time, though, rather than open the door, he listened at it first, pressing his ear against the grain of the cheap wood and holding his breath, terrified that he would hear a skittering sound on the other side of the barrier. What he heard instead shocked him more. Daniel was talking to someone. James recoiled for a second, and then, when he caught his breath, he all but kicked the door in. Daniel was already awake, indeed, sitting up in bed, but he was not saying anything now. The light flashed on, and James stalked halfway into the room before stopping, suddenly torn. What did he want more, to confront that his son could speak again, or to find whomever he was speaking to? The creak of a door hinge settled the matter for him. He ran to the closet and threw it open. There was nothing inside, or at least nothing that shouldn't be there. He swept aside clothes on their hangers, but nothing was hiding between them. Then he dragged the toy box out and emptied it onto the floor. Nothing. He combed along the bare walls and floor, and yes, the ceiling, pushing aside every bit of rubbish and stray knickknacks so that he could be sure, absolutely sure, that nothing was hiding. All the while, Daniel watched him. After a few minutes, James was panting and covered in sweat, and the closet was bare, and there were neither intruders nor answers inside. It struck him as funny, somehow, and he started to laugh very quietly. He kicked his son's toys out of the way as he went to sit down on the bed, dazed. He became aware all at once of several things. First being that he had not slept in days and was nowhere near his right mind. The second was how close he'd come to really losing it for good. Tomorrow, he decided, they would both sleep until the afternoon, and when they did wake up, he and Daniel would get out of this creaky old house. No more staying cooped up like prisoners, and no more checkups, and no more dreams about monsters. He would even take the bars off the windows. It was time to get back to living like real people again. It was time to... James saw it when he brushed a hand through Daniel's hair. He pulled Daniel, a little too roughly, closer. His son acquiesced to the examination without fidgeting or complaint, as James pawed the side of his head, hoping that what he was seeing would somehow stop being apparent. He stared and stared until he ached from not blinking. But there was no denying what was right in front of his eyes. Daniel was missing an ear. No, he realized with mounting nausea. Both ears. There was no injury, no incision, no mark where they should have been, simply smooth, blank flesh. As blank as Daniel's quiet, unperturbed demeanor. James swept him up in his arms and ran into the hall. He was not sure where he was going or what he meant to do when he got there. He just knew that there was now nothing more important than getting his son out of that house. But their path was cut off. A naked man sat in the hallway with his back to them. No, not a man. James recognized its stretched limbs and stooped shoulders. The pale thing squatted on its haunches, rocking back and forth, like it was palsied. It almost seemed to be in vain. James hugged his son closer and backed away. Then he heard Daniel's voice. "Daddy." James turned to Daniel, and he heard the voice again. "Daddy." But Daniel's lips hadn't moved. James looked back at the hunched figure. Its head jerked when it talked, like a tick. "Hello, Daddy." James' mouth went dry. It took several tries before he could speak. "Don't call me that." "It is this voice's name for you." "Go away. Leave my family alone." "But I am your family." The longer it talked, the more the voice became distorted and blurred. An icy feeling nestled in James' stomach. "Who are you?" "Someone who come to visit." "Why here?" "You invited me." James' heart thudded against the inside of his chest. "Why?" "I had something you wanted." James licked his dry lips. "You're lying. You don't have anything I want. I want you to leave. Leave and never come back." "Who is Daniel's mother?" James blanked. "What?" "Who is Daniel's mother?" "The hell kind of question is that?" "How old is Daniel?" James blinked. The thing's voice caused a pinching pain in the center of his forehead. "Stop asking me these things." "When is Daniel's birthday?" "I don't know." "What is his middle name?" "Shut up." "What was his first word?" "I said shut up." James wanted to tear the thing apart with his bare hands. Only the heaviness of Daniel in his arms kept him where he was. "You were alone. You wanted a son, so I made one for you." James' hands began to shake. "That doesn't make sense. Made out of what?" "Out of myself." James' stomach turned over. "But now I need those parts back." Daniel picked at James' shoulder to get his attention. Something was strange about Daniel's face. "Danny, open your eyes." Daniel scrunched his eyes shut tighter. "Open your eyes, Danny. Danny, open your eyes. Open your eyes." Daniel shook his head, trying to refuse, but he couldn't hold it forever. Eventually, his eyelids flicked up in James. saw the truth. Daniel's eyes were gone. James almost dropped him. For a second, he wanted to throw his son down so he could stop looking into those empty holes in his face. Daniel opened his mouth as if to speak, but of course, he had no voice. He is coming back to be part of me again. No, give him back! Give him back! I cannot. It has been too long. I warned you this would happen. You're lying. You're lying. You're a fucking liar. Give me my son back. Give him back. I do not lie. I warned you. He could not exist forever. But you do not remember. You can only remember what I want you to. You forget all the times we have talked. Daniel felt like a doll or an empty bag. His hair was falling out, disappearing before it touched the ground. His hands vanished into his sleeves, and his feet rolled up inside his pants cuffs. James cradled the tiny, shapeless thing. Tears streamed down his face. Soon he held a pile of empty clothes, and those too were gone. He looked around the house. Toys disappeared. Photos vanished from their frames. Daniel's little shoes were no longer by the door. James turned toward Daniel's room and confronted a wall where the door should be. He groped the blank surface, fingertips scrambling. He hit his head against the wall. The pain didn't feel real. Why did you do this? It was what you wanted, and I learned so much. This is impossible. People will ask, people will wonder. The police, the hospitals, the people in the neighborhood. They have already forgotten him. They only remembered what I wanted them to, like you. James pressed his hands to his aching skull. Will I at least remember him after this? You can try, but your mind will fail you. Now that everything he was is part of me again. James sat on the floor, looking at the blank wall. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the thing creep toward him, and even felt its wet hand on his shoulder, but he did not look at it. If I won't remember any of this, he said, then why tell me? Because a father should know. And then James was alone. Abigail worried about James sometimes. When they met a year ago, he said that he'd never been married and he'd never had kids, but there was a certain pained expression he assumed when he said the last part. Abigail knew that look. She'd met parents who lost children before. You learn to recognize it. And there were other things about him that worried her, too. Sometimes she would find him staring at a particular spot on the wall, brow furrowed in concentration. He did not seem to realize he was doing it. And of course there was the insomnia and the sleepwalking to consider, too. Yes, there was lots to worry about, but she loved him all the same. James still said he'd never had kids, and neither had she. She'd long wanted one, but it was impossible, and she worried that James wouldn't stay with a woman who couldn't be a mother, though he constantly assured her that it was not so. There were times, and more often of late, there were the nights when James took to sleepwalking, and even Abigail imagined that she heard strange scuttling noises in the house and saw impossible shapes in dark corners, when she thought she would do anything, absolutely anything, if it meant having a little daughter for she and James to raise. And at those moments, she became truly afraid. But she never knew why.
Chilling tales for dark nights.